In 1925, a farmer in Kansas could watch a funnel cloud drop out of the sky and still know his family would live because of a hole he had dug by hand 3 summers earlier. There was no insurance adjuster coming, no FEMA check, no contractor on speed dial. When a storm took your roof, you rebuilt it or you went without. So Americans got clever. They learned to read the clouds, anchor their homes to the bare earth, and turn dirt, rope, and stone into armor against the worst weather on the continent. Number 8 saved more lives in Tornado Alley than any warning siren ever built. And number 2 is so effective that modern hurricane codes quietly copied it. Before we start, hit subscribe. These are the 25 poor man's skills that protected American homes long before anyone sold you a policy. Let's begin the countdown. Number 25, whitewashing and pine tar. Your great-grandfather whitewashed everything, and it was never just for looks. Fence posts, clapboard siding, the underside of the porch, all of it got a coat of lime wash mixed cheap from slaked lime and water for pennies a bucket. That thin white skin sealed raw wood against rain and rot. Every spring the family recoated the south and west walls, the sides that took the weather head on. On barns and coastal cottages, they'd brush on hot pine tar where wind drove the rain hardest. The coating filled the grain, shed water like a duck's back, and slowed the swelling and cracking that let a storm peel a board loose. A house that shed water stayed standing. We pay for premium paint now and think we invented weatherproofing. Grandpa did it for the cost of a bag of lime. Number 24, banking the house. Before insulation came in rolls, families banked their homes every fall, and it doubled as storm armor. They'd pile dirt, straw, cornstalks, or even manure in a thick skirt around the base of the house, sometimes 2 feet high, packing it tight against the foundation and lower boards. The banking sealed the drafty gap where wind screamed under the floor and drove cold up through the planks. But it did more than that. That wall of packed earth braced the sill against gusts, trying to lift and rack the whole frame, and it kept driving rain from rotting the base of the walls. Come spring, they'd shovel it all away and let the wood breathe. It cost nothing but a Saturday of labor. A banked house sat lower and tighter to the ground, and a house tight to the ground gave the wind far less to grab. Number 23, reading the sky, first pattern break. Here's a skill that saved more lives than any tool on this list, and it cost absolutely nothing. Before radar, before the radio said a word, farm families read the weather in the sky itself. A greenish-yellow cast to the clouds meant hail, sometimes worse. A dead, heavy stillness with birds gone quiet meant a tornado was building its nerve. Mares' tails and mackerel scales make tall ships carry low sails, they'd recite, watching high, wispy clouds for a storm 2 days out. A ring around the moon meant rain within a day. Cattle lying down, smoke hanging low, the smell of the pond turning sharp, every sign got logged in memory and passed to the children. A farmer who could read 3 hours of warning into a green sky had 3 hours to get the animals in, the shutters up, and the family down the cellar steps. That knowledge was the original early warning system, and it lived in people's heads for free. Number 22, battening down. When the sky turned, the first thing a family did was hunt down everything loose, because in a real blow, your own belongings become the weapons that break your windows. Wash tubs, milk cans, ladders, the wheelbarrow, loose boards from the woodpile, all of it got dragged inside or roped down flat against the ground. Rain barrels were emptied and turned over so they could not sail through the barn wall. Gates were tied open or lifted off their hinges. Chickens were shooed into the coop, the horse into the deepest stall. The phrase "batten down the hatches" came off the ships, but the prairie wife made it a landlocked ritual. She knew a loose porch chair at 60 miles an hour hit like a cannonball. 10 minutes of hauling and tying was the difference between a scary night and a shattered front window letting the storm inside. Number 21, rain barrels and cisterns. When a storm knocked out your well or fouled the creek with mud, water was the emergency, and every smart household had a private reserve waiting. Wooden rain barrels sat under every downspout, catching roof runoff for laundry in the garden. But the serious families dug cisterns, big underground tanks lined with brick that held hundreds of gallons of rainwater filtered through gravel and sand. After a flood turned the groundwater into sludge for a week, the family with a full cistern didn't have to walk 2 miles to a spring or drink something that would make the children sick. The cistern was insurance you could dip a bucket into, and it meant that when the storm cut you off from the world, you could ride it out on your own supply. Number 20, chinking the cabin. In log homes across Appalachia and the frontier, the difference between a snug house and a miserable one was the chinking, the packing jammed between the logs. Families mixed clay, sand, lime, and whatever binder they had, hog hair, straw, even ashes, into a stiff daub and forced it into every gap. Done right, it turned a stack of logs into a solid wall that wind couldn't whistle through and rain couldn't drive between. But chinking cracked over a hard winter, so every spring the family walked the whole cabin log by log, re-daubing where the weather had gotten in. A wall with tight chinking didn't just stay warm, it stayed rigid. And a rigid wall doesn't flex and fail when a gale leans on it all night. It kept the storm on the outside where it belonged. Number 19, snowbanking. Up in the northern plains in New England, the winter storm was the killer, and families used the very snow that trapped them as their shield. After a blizzard dumped its load, the men shoveled it up against the north and west walls of the house in a deep bank, packing it firm. It sounds backwards letting the snow touch the house, but packed snow is a magnificent insulator, and that white wall killed the wind-chill stone dead against the foundation. Inside, the difference was startling. A room that had been losing heat to the gale suddenly held its warmth. Homesteaders in Dakota dugouts survived 40 below nights this way, half buried in a drift on purpose. Free material delivered by the same storm trying to freeze you out turned against itself. Number 18, ditching and French drains. Water was patient, and it would find the low spot under your house and rot it out or float it away, so the careful homeowner controlled where the water went. They dug shallow ditches to carry runoff around the house and away from the foundation, grading the whole yard to slope downhill from the walls. The clever ones built what we now call a French drain, a trench filled with stone and gravel that let groundwater drain off before it ever pooled against the sill. It was unglamorous work with a shovel and a good eye for the lay of the land, but a house on high, well-drained ground survived storms that drowned its neighbors in the hollow. Move the water before it moves you. Number 17, storm windows. A single pane of old glass was a terrible thing in a storm, thin, cold, and the first thing to shatter and let the weather pour in. So families built storm windows, a second wooden-framed pane that fit over the outside of the regular window every fall. That trapped pocket of dead air between the two panes did double duty, blocking the cold and bracing the glass against the wind so it couldn't rattle loose or bow inward and break. Come spring, they came down and got stacked in the barn, each one numbered in chalk to match its window. In a bad blow, that second layer of glass and wood was the difference between a whistling draft and a broken window spraying the parlor. Simple carpentry and a little glazing putty made every window in the house twice as tough for the season that needed it most. Number 16, solid wood shutters. Long before plywood, the coastal house came armed with real shutters, thick planks of wood hinged beside every window, not the decorative flaps we nail on for show today. When a hurricane was named on the wind, the family swung them closed and barred them from the inside with a solid crosspiece. Those shutters stopped flying debris cold, the tree limbs and shingles and sand that a storm turns into shrapnel. They kept the wind from getting inside and pressurizing the house, which is what lifts a roof clean off. On the Gulf and the Carolinas, a set of good shutters was as standard as a front door. The best were made of 2 layers of board crossed at angles for strength. Closed and barred, they turned every window from the weakest point in the house into one of the strongest. That's protection you operated with your own 2 hands. Number 15, the sod roof. Out on the treeless plains, there was no lumber for a proper roof, so the settlers roofed with the earth itself, and it turned out to be storm-proof by accident. They laid a frame of whatever poles they could find, covered it with brush and grass, then stacked thick bricks of prairie sod, grass side up, right on top. That heavy layer of packed dirt and living root didn't blow away, because you can't lift a roof that weighs tons and grows into itself. It shrugged off hail that would have hammered a shingle roof to splinters, and it wouldn't catch a spark from the lightning that scoured the open prairie. Yes, it leaked mud when the rain came hard, and every homesteader wife cursed the drips. But when the tornado passed and the frame houses were gone, the sod house was still there, hunkered into the ground, its earthen roof exactly where they'd packed it. Number 14, windbreak trees. Second pattern break, and this one changed the map of America. In the 1930s, the Dust Bowl taught the plains a brutal lesson, that a house standing alone on open ground caught the full fury of every wind that crossed 1,000 miles of flat. So families and the government planted trees, millions of them, in long rows on the north and west sides of the farmstead. These shelter belts of cottonwood, cedar, and elm broke the wind before it ever reached the house. A well-placed windbreak could cut the wind hitting your walls by half, slash your heating bills, and stop the blizzard from burying your door in a drift. It took 10 years to grow into its job, which meant a man planted it not for himself, but for his children. Whole counties are still sheltered by trees a grandfather set in the ground during the worst years America ever farmed. Number 13, Osage orange hedges. Before the windbreak came the living fence, and the plains had a favorite, the Osage orange, a scrappy thorned tree the settlers called hedge apple. Planted close and trimmed low, it grew into a barrier so dense, the old saying went, that it was horse-high, bull-strong, and hog-tight. It fenced the livestock without a foot of wire, which cost real money out on the frontier, but it also stood as a windbreak and a snow catch along the field edge. Its wood was so tough that fence posts cut from it outlasted 3 generations, still standing in fields today. In a storm, a thick hedgerow slowed the wind, trapped the drifting snow before it reached the buildings, and gave the cattle a wall to shelter behind. It was armor, fence, and firewood, all growing from one row of thorny trees you never had to buy again. Number 12, lightning rods. Third pattern break, and here's where the science caught up to the folk wisdom. Benjamin Franklin figured out the lightning rod in 1752, and by the 1800s, the traveling lightning rod man was a fixture on every rural road, selling iron rods and copper cable off the back of his wagon. The idea was simple, and it worked. A metal rod on the peak of the roof, wired down to a plate buried deep in wet ground, gave the lightning an easy path straight to the earth instead of through your house. On the open plains and hilltops, where a barn or a farmhouse was the tallest thing for miles, this wasn't a luxury, it was survival. A single strike could burn a barn full of hay and a season's work to the ground in 20 minutes. Farmers who scoffed watched their neighbors' places go up in smoke. The rod cost a few dollars and a day to install, and it turned the most terrifying part of a thunderstorm into a harmless flash and a wisp of smoke off the ground rod. Number 11, the hip roof. The shape of your roof decided whether the wind took it, and the old builders knew it in their bones. A gable roof, the common triangle with 2 flat ends, catches the wind like a sail and gives it a big flat wall to shove against. And in a real storm, that end wall is the first thing to blow in. The hip roof slopes on all 4 sides down to the walls, so no matter which way the wind comes, it hits an angle and slides up and over, instead of slamming into a flat face. Coastal builders and prairie carpenters favored the hip roof for exactly this reason. Generations before, wind tunnel tests proved them right. It cost a little more in framing, but it was the single smartest choice a builder could make in storm country. The wind that ripped the gable off the neighbor's house just went sliding harmlessly over the hip roof next door. Number 10, cross-bracing the frame. A house frame of straight up and down posts and beams is a surprisingly wobbly thing, and the wind knows it. Push on one corner and the whole rectangle can rack over sideways like a shoved cardboard box. And once it starts to lean, a storm finishes the job. The old carpenters stopped that with diagonals, running braces from corner to corner inside the walls, cut in at 45 degrees and pegged or nailed tight. That single diagonal turned a floppy square into a rigid triangle, and a triangle doesn't budge. Barn builders were fanatical about it, filling the great open frames with cross bracing so the whole structure could stand against a gale with a full hayloft swaying overhead. It's the same principle holding up every skyscraper today. A handful of boards set at the right angle, costing almost nothing, was the skeleton that kept a house from folding flat when the wind put its shoulder into the wall. Number 9. Boarding and taping the windows. When the storm was almost on top of you, the glass was the enemy, and families had a fast last-minute drill to save it. They nailed boards, barn planks, shutters, whatever was at hand, straight across the outside of the windows to take the hit from flying debris, and across the glass itself they ran wide strips of cloth tape or gummed paper in a big X corner to corner. The tape didn't stop the window from breaking. Folks misunderstood that even then, but it held the shattered pane together in a sheet instead of letting it explode into 100 flying knives across the room where the children were huddled. On the coast, boarding up was the ritual that told the whole street a hurricane was serious. It was cheap, it was fast, and it turned the most dangerous surface in the house into something that would fail quietly instead of spraying glass across the parlor. Number 8. The storm cellar. This is the one that saved more lives in Tornado Alley than anything ever built, and nearly every farmhouse from Texas to Nebraska had one. They called it the cyclone cellar, the Frady hole, the storm pit, a room dug by hand into the earth beside the house, roofed with heavy timbers and a mound of packed dirt with a slanted door you latched from the inside. Down there, 8 feet under, a tornado could tear the entire house off its foundation and scatter it across the county, and the family sat in the dark on a wooden bench, safe, listening to the freight train roar past over their heads. They stocked it with a lantern, jars of water, and a few quilts. Fathers dug them the first summer on a new place before they even finished the barn, because on the open plains, the twister wasn't a maybe, it was a when. When the green sky came, everyone knew exactly where to run. That hole in the ground was the whole reason the family was still alive to rebuild. Number 7. Dead men anchors. Here is a trick straight off the sailing ships that the storm country builder brought ashore. A dead man is an anchor buried in the ground, a log, a heavy stone, a bundle of timbers sunk deep in a pit and packed over so it can never pull loose. Homesteaders used them to tie down anything the wind wanted to steal, running cables or heavy rope from the buried dead man up to the corners of a light building, a shed, a windmill, even the house itself on the most exposed sites. The earth held the dead man held the rope, and the rope held the roof to the planet. On the treeless plains where there was nothing else to tie to, a few dead men buried before storm season meant the wind could howl all it wanted and the building stayed put. Quiet, invisible insurance, waiting for the one night it would earn its keep. Number 6. Roof tie-downs. Fourth pattern break, and this is where the dead man met the roof. The old-timers understood the terrible truth about storms, that the wind doesn't push a roof off, it lifts it off, sucking it up like a wing on an airplane. Once the roof goes, the walls have nothing holding them together, and the whole house comes apart. So in the worst wind country, families literally tied the roof to the ground. They ran ropes or chains up and over the ridge and down both sides, cinching them to the dead men buried in the yard. So the whole roof was strapped to the earth like a load on a wagon. Before a named hurricane, coastal families would throw lines over the roof and stake them down for exactly this reason. It looked crude, a house trussed up in rope like a Sunday roast, but it worked on the one principle that matters: keep the roof on, and the house lives. Lose the roof, and you lose everything under it. Number 5. Raising the house. Down in the flood country of the Gulf and the great river valleys, the smartest families didn't fight the water. They got above it. They built the house up on piers, brick columns, or stout cypress posts that lifted the whole floor 3, 4, even 8 feet off the ground. When the river jumped its banks or the storm surge came ashore, the flood ran underneath the house instead of through it, and the family stayed dry on their island of a floor. The Louisiana raised cottage and the Gulf Coast beach house were built this way for 200 years, and the ones built right are still standing. It cost more posts and more stairs. But the family in the low-slung house lost everything they owned to the mud, and the family up on the piers hosed off their yard and went back to living. You cannot flood a floor the water never reaches. Number 4, sandbagging and levees. When the water rose and there was no getting above it, the whole community grabbed shovels and built a wall against the flood by hand. Sandbags, burlap sacks filled with dirt or sand and stacked in overlapping rows, could raise a low levee around a house or a barn in a few frantic hours if enough neighbors turned out. The overlapping bags settled into each other and formed a surprisingly tough dam that turned back the rising creek. Along the big rivers, farmers maintained earthen levees year-round, walking them in flood season to plug leaks where the water pushed through. It was brutal, muddy, all-night labor, and everyone showed up because next time it would be your house behind the wall. A line of sandbags thrown up in time saved farms that would otherwise have vanished under the brown water, mussel, burlap, and dirt standing between the family and the flood. Number 3, the root cellar. Every farm had one, and it was survival wearing 2 hats. The root cellar was a room dug into a hillside or under the house, cool and dark, where the family stored the potatoes, apples, canned goods, and cured meat that carried them through the winter. But when the storm came, that same buried room became a shelter, thick-walled, roofed with earth, and stocked by pure luck of its purpose with all the food and water you'd want if you were trapped for days. After a storm cut the roads and knocked out every store for 50 miles, the family with a full root cellar wasn't waiting on a relief truck. They were eating their own canning by lantern light in a room the storm couldn't touch. It protected the harvest from the weather and the family from the storm. One dug room did the work of a bomb shelter and a grocery store combined. Number 2, homemade hurricane straps. This is the skill modern building codes quietly copied, and the coastal carpenter was doing it a century before the inspectors made it law. The great weakness of any house is the joints, where the roof meets the walls, where the walls meet the foundation, because that's where the wind pries the whole thing apart piece by piece. So the old builders strapped those joints together with metal. They forged flat iron straps, or cut them from barrel hoops and scrap, and nailed them across every critical connection, tying the rafters to the wall plates and the walls down to the sill, so the house became one continuous piece from the ridge to the ground. A storm couldn't peel it apart layer by layer because there were no loose layers. It was all bolted into one. Walk into a hardware store today and you'll buy a galvanized hurricane clip stamped out by the 1,000, and it does the exact same job the coastal blacksmith did by hand. The building code didn't invent it, it just finally admitted the old-timers were right. Number 1, the barn raising. And here, at number 1, is the skill that was the truest insurance of all. Because before there were insurance companies, there was the neighbor. When a storm flattened a family's barn or tore the roof off their house, they did not file a claim and wait. They sent word down the road, and on the appointed morning, the whole community arrived. 20, 30, 50 men with their own tools and teams, the women with food enough to feed an army. And in a single day, they raised a new frame from bare timbers, the whole thing going up to shouts and hammering while the children ran underfoot. It was understood by everyone that this was a debt, and that when the next storm came for your place, these same families would appear in your yard at dawn. That was the real protection standing behind every home in America. Not a policy, but a promise that no family faced the storm alone. The community was the insurance company, and it never once denied a claim. There they are, 25 skills that kept American families alive and under a roof long before anyone thought to mail them a premium notice. Spot one of these next time you drive past an old farmstead, the storm cellar door, the row of windbreak trees, the house up on its piers. Then tell me in the comments which one surprised you most, because these weren't just tricks. They were the reason your great-grandparents were still standing when the storm moved on.